Harvard versus the US president. This could be the mother of all battles. Joining me now, two special guests. Professor Irfan Nuruddin is professor at Georgetown University, one of America's leading universities. Edward Luce, editor of Financial Times, has just brought out a best-selling book, a biography of Zbigniew Brzezinski. Congratulations, it's on the New York Times bestseller list, Ed. Good to have both of you on the show. Let's get straight into this Harvard versus President battle, Ed. Why don't you take off first? What are we seeing? Is this Trump now trying to take vengeance on America's and, dare I say, the world's most prestigious university because they simply weren't willing to fall in line?
Essentially, that's it. I mean, they wouldn't bend the knee to Trump. When initially a few weeks ago, the Trump administration tried to take over control of its admissions policies and indeed of its curriculum, and cut a ton of money, billions of dollars of federal research funds, Harvard sued. So that, was strike one in Trump's book. There are several federal investigations now of Harvard on the allegation that it's what Trump calls a woke madrasa, that it's somehow a Maoist indoctrination camp. I think the real reason for this is that it's real red meat to the base. I mean, Harvard is not beloved by middle America. It's seen as very elitist, and this is for Trump, all very good politics.
But isn't it also, you're saying, when the US president calls arguably the world's most prestigious university a woke madrasa, I mean, what is he signaling? Surely you're not going to make America great again across the world by saying, we're not going to allow foreign students, for example, to enter Harvard, and you're going to call it a woke madrasa. So is Donald Trump somewhere losing the plot, according to you, Ed?
I mean, he is the destruction to America's brand, to its research capabilities, to its economic innovation, to its attractiveness as a destination is incalculable. This is a huge self-inflicted wound on America. But the way Trump thinks, this sort of quite reptilian sort of side of his brain, is that people who look down on me will be punished. And I am acting on behalf of the millions out there who feel looked down upon or condescended to by America's educational elites. And nobody, none of them care about these well-connected foreigners, Indians, Chinese, others, Brits, who are studying at Harvard. No tears will be shed for them. That's essentially Trump's mindset.
And it's interesting you're saying that, because the fact is that we are told that Donald Trump wanted his son to desperately get into Harvard. Didn't quite get in, but that's, that just shows where Donald Trump comes from. But Professor Nuruddin, how worrying is it? You've got a lot of Indian students in a university like Georgetown. If this happens to Harvard, it could happen to universities across America. Hundreds of Indian students, their future could be at stake. How worrying is it when the US president says, I'm not going to allow any foreign student enrollment anymore in a university like Harvard? It could have a cataclysmic effect, presumably right down the line.
It is absolutely terrifying, Rajdeep, both for the existential survival of American universities that rely on the incredible talent of international students from India, as you point out, but also from China, from all over the world. I mean, one of the things that makes America truly the envy of the higher education landscape globally is that it has become the best higher education space in the world. I mean, if you look at the world's best 100 universities, 500 universities, a disproportionate number of them, literally 90% of them, are located in the United States, and they are fueled by the incredible talent that flows here every year from all over the world. And of course, that talent historically has stayed in America disproportionately, contributing then to innovation. There's no coincidence that half of the founders of startups in Silicon Valley, that the CEOs of the Fortune 500 companies are people who came to America from other parts of the world to study here and then stay and work here. So it is existential. And I think higher education understands Harvard as being the tip of the spear over here, that if they can do it to Harvard, they can do it to every university that they want to. And as Ed correctly says, this is retribution. This is not based on any genuine claim of damage caused by Harvard. This is simply retribution because Harvard refused to let Trump bully them into submission. And so every university that cares about its own academic freedom is going to say, if we stand up for our values, this is exactly what's going to happen. The
But
positive part of this,
Professor Nuruddin, when Trump takes when he gave an explanation for it, or when his officials gave it, said that these universities have become hubs of anti-Semitism, referring to the protests that have taken place in these universities over the Palestine situation, that they've encouraged anti-Semitism on their campuses. How would you respond to it? Your university also saw protests over Gaza. Is it that these universities are being put on notice by the American president? If you have these kind of protests on campuses, then prepare to face the wrath of the administration?
that is exactly right. But we want to be very careful over here. What the Trump administration and a certain faction of, let's call it the pro-Israel lobby in the United States, have attempted to do is make any criticism of American foreign policy vis-a-vis Israel equated with anti-Semitism. No university worth its salt has any sympathy or any tolerance for anti-Semitism, not Georgetown, not Harvard, not anyone. It is probably the case that in many universities, universities have been slow to act decisively when genuine cases of anti-Semitism have happened on campus, and unfortunately, these are quite common at university spaces. But this is a fine line between cracking down on perceived anti-Semitism and protecting the right of free speech on a college campus. So it's a tough line to have. The notion that Trump has made himself the champion of Jewish people at the same time that he sits and has dinner with virulent anti-Semites, white nationalists in the United States, that he refers to Chuck Schumer, the Democratic Majority Leader, a Jewish person, and says he is not Jewish, right? The notion that Trump decides who is actually a real Jew and who isn't, who is actually pro-Israel and who isn't, needs to be rejected on the face of it. But yes, your point is absolutely right, that what Trump has successfully done is equate pro-Palestine, anti-US foreign policy vis-a-Israel protests on college campuses as being the equivalent of anti-Semitism, and saying those of universities that have refused to crack down on these are therefore prima facie guilty of anti-Semitism and therefore have to deal with the wrath of the United States federal government.
Ed Luce, Harvard's soft power, much like Oxford and Cambridge in the United Kingdom, has existed over decades. It is a university that stretches back to centuries. Do you believe that Harvard has the capacity, given the fact that they have this huge endowment running into billions of dollars and this rich legacy, that they can fight back in a way that perhaps other American citizens can't? Therefore, this battle becomes a test case, not just for Harvard University, but indeed for America's ability to, in a way, stop presidential overreach.
Yeah, if Harvard with an endowment of roughly $50 billion, which is, bigger than the GDP of many countries, if Harvard doesn't have the firepower to stand up to these blatantly illegal assaults on its independence, on its free speech, and on its status as a private institution, then everybody else might as well pack it in and go home. So it has to be standing up. And you remember, of course, the first target of Trump was the Columbia University, and they did fold. They acceded to almost all the demands and got nothing for it. So it's not as if he's incentivizing sort of people to cooperate and then calling off the dogs. Columbia is now under his thumb. As regards the weaponization of anti-Semitism and Trump accusing Harvard of teaching anti-Semitism, I think the rule of thumb that with Trump, accusation is actually confession is probably a better way of decoding this, because the far right, the genuine anti-Semites, the Holocaust deniers, the people who are genuinely motivated by hate, are much more potent on the right around Trump and in MAGA world than on the left. Where, you go to somewhere like Harvard, a very high share of the faculty and of students are Jewish. And I know Jewish students there, and I know Jewish academics there. Some are worried, Some say this is really overblown, but nobody for a second thinks that Trump actually cares about anti-Semitism. This is this is a pretext for an assault on institutions that he resents.
Do you believe he can? Do you believe he can get away with it, Ed Luce? Do you believe the President of the United States, arguably the most powerful person in the world, can get away with clamping down on America's most powerful, or dare I say, the world's most powerful, or certainly well-endowed university?
I think he could. I mean, if he's serious, the powers at the disposal of a president, I mean, especially the expanded definition that Trump has, then yes, he can, he can destroy countries if he wishes. So institutions shouldn't be too hard. Harvard doesn't have an army. If he wants to destroy Harvard, no court is going to stop him.
Can I just ask you then, Professor Nuruddin, hearing that from Ed Luce, that no court can stop him if he's determined to, in a way, quash Harvard, what does that mean for Indian students, not just at Harvard, but across American universities? What would your advice be for Indian students who are planning to come to American universities or indeed are in American universities today?
That's a very difficult question. I will say, maybe just because I have to believe it, I do think that the courts are going to stop him on his attack on Harvard, and I think that the courts are going to reject and find illegal this notion that Harvard cannot enroll international students. One of the things that we have seen over and over is that Trump attempts to crack down on American institutions are slowly being pushed back on, not as fast and definitely not as comprehensively as we would like. So I share Ed's pessimism. The state of the world is not rosy right now. But
so what should students do as Harvard pushes back? As Harvard pushes back, should Indian students just wait to see how this plays out?
Well, I think there are two things that we should be doing if you're, an Indian student or parent of an Indian student who aspires to study abroad. One is to consider the whole global landscape of higher education institutions. For as much as I said about American higher education being the envy of the world, there are really incredible institutions all over the world, and of course one hopes in India as well, that could also be destinations of study. I think if you are a student over here, you have to be very, very savvy about your use of social media. The less, the better, because we know that they're using any pretext to cancel visas. Definitely any participation in protest activity should be really, really considered deeply. I don't want to suggest that you shouldn't do it. But I think you want to be very careful and very sort of wise about what you choose to put your name to in public. And finally, they're talking now about removing OPT altogether, the optional practical training that has typically been the transition for international students, including most Indian students, into the American workforce. We know that the H-1B program is incredibly under attack. And so I think the other thing that Indian students and parents of Indian students need to consider is whether or not the investment in an American education is worth it if the long-term job prospects in America are increasingly vanishing. And that's a very hard value proposition.
Those are very troubling words indeed, both from you, Professor Nuruddin, and earlier from you, Ed Luce. Donald Trump, out of control, perhaps being vengeful towards Harvard, being reckless, some would say, but that is Donald Trump. Will he get away with it, or will Harvard push back? As we said at the outset, it's the mother of all battles. I appreciate Ed Luce, Professor Nuruddin, for shedding light on that story for our viewers. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.